The clock on the wall of the Greasy Spoon Diner read 11:47 a.m. The air, thick with the smell of stale coffee and frying bacon, hummed with the low murmur of lunch-hour conversations. Outside, a pale November sun did little to warm the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, where 12 motorcycles sat in a precise, gleaming row. Inside, at a long table shoved into the back corner, sat their owners. They were large men, dressed in worn leather and denim, their presence a silent island of gravity in the bustling room. Their vests, adorned with the winged death's head, were the only introduction they needed. At their center sat a man they called Rhino, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, his sheer physical volume making the vinyl booth creak in protest. He was laughing, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor, a piece of steak halfway to his mouth. Then the sound stopped. It did not fade. It was severed. The laughter caught in his throat, a sharp, ugly hitch. His eyes, moments before crinkling with mirth, widened in sudden, stark panic. His fork clattered to the plate. His hands, thick with scar tissue and engine grease, flew to his neck. The murmur of the diner continued for 3 seconds, oblivious. Then, a man named Preacher, sitting to Rhino's right, saw it. His own smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold focus. A single, almost imperceptible hand signal, a slight twitch of 2 fingers, flashed across the table. In perfect unison, 11 men stopped eating. They didn't stand, they didn't shout. They simply became still, their collective attention a palpable force aimed at their leader. Rhino's face was turning a dusky shade of red, his powerful body useless against a small, lodged piece of food. The waitress froze mid-stride, a pot of coffee trembling in her hand. A family in a nearby booth pulled their children closer, their faces pale with vicarious fear. The entire diner had become a tableau of suspended animation, a breath held collectively. But one person moved. From a small, 2-person table near the kitchen doors, a slip of a girl, no older than 7, slid from her chair. She was a whisper of a child, dressed in a faded sweatshirt 2 sizes too large and jeans worn thin at the knees. Her hair was a tangle of brown, her face smudged with something that might have been dirt or a fading bruise. Her name was Alara. No one had noticed her. She had been nursing a glass of water for the past hour, waiting for her uncle to finish a meeting across the street. While the room was paralyzed by the unfolding drama, she moved with an unnerving calm. She slipped between the tables, her small form navigating the forest of frozen legs. She reached the biker's booth, so small she barely came up to the tabletop. She did not look at the frightened faces of the onlookers or the stunned expressions of the men in leather. She looked only at Rhino's back. Without a word, she balled up her tiny fist and drove it, with all the force her 70-pound body could muster, into the space just below his rib cage. It was a small, desperate thump, almost comical in its inadequacy against his massive frame. But it was precise. It was the exact motion she had seen on a faded poster in the school nurse's office. Rhino's body convulsed. A violent, wet cough erupted from his lungs, and the piece of steak shot out of his mouth, landing on the checkered linoleum with a soft, final thud. Air flooded back into his lungs. He gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, his color slowly returning from purple to a blotchy red. He slumped forward, bracing himself on the table, breathing in deep, shuddering gulps. The diner exhaled with him. A nervous ripple of applause broke out, then died just as quickly. The men at the table remained still, their eyes now fixed on the little girl who stood by the booth, her hand still balled into a fist, her expression unreadable. Rhino slowly, painfully, turned his head. He looked down at the child. He saw the frayed cuffs of her sweatshirt, the worn-out sneakers, the old soul weariness in her young eyes. He saw the faint, yellowing shadow on her cheekbone. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He simply reached out a hand the size of a dinner plate and gently, so gently, rested it on her shoulder. At that exact moment, the bell above the diner door jingled violently. A man stumbled in, reeking of cheap cologne and impatience. "Alara!" Let's go. I ain't got all day. His voice was a greasy rasp. The girl flinched, a full-body tremor that traveled from her shoulder, through Rhino's hand, and into the silent heart of the Brotherhood. 11 pairs of eyes lifted from the girl and settled on the man in the doorway. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The conflict had just begun. The man in the doorway was Silas. He had a weak chin and the shifty eyes of someone perpetually looking for an angle. He saw the scene, the collection of bikers, the shaken man at the table, his niece standing beside them, and his face curdled into a sneer of annoyance. "What's this? Causing trouble again, girl?" He started toward her, his steps heavy with unearned authority. Alara shrank under Rhino's hand, her small body trying to make itself even smaller, to disappear into the cracked vinyl of the booth. Rhino didn't move the hand from her shoulder. He didn't have to look at Silas. His gaze remained on Alara, watching the flicker of terror in her eyes, a familiar darkness he recognized from a world no child should ever know. Preacher, however, slowly rose to his feet. He wasn't the biggest man at the table, but his presence was absolute. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, placing himself between Silas and the booth. "She's all right," Preacher said. His voice was calm, a low baritone that carried no overt threat, yet it stopped Silas in his tracks. "She just helped our brother." Silas's eyes darted from Preacher to Rhino, who was now sitting up straighter, his breathing evening out. He saw the vests, the patches that read President and SGT at arms. His bluster faltered, replaced by a whining defensiveness. "Yeah, well, she should have been waiting by the door." "Come on, Alara," he gestured impatiently, his fingers twitching. Alara didn't move. She was anchored by the weight of the hand on her shoulder, a pressure that felt less like a restraint and more like a shield. Rhino finally looked up, his eyes locking with Silas's. He said nothing. He simply looked. It was a gaze that stripped away pretense, that saw the rot beneath the surface. Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was used to being the intimidating one in Alara's life, the source of fear. He was not equipped for this silent, unified wall of judgment. "Look, she's my niece. My responsibility," he insisted, his voice a little too loud. "We've got to go." "Where do you live?" The question came from a biker at the end of the table, a man they called Doc, whose hands were steady enough to fix a carburetor or set a bone with equal precision. The question was conversational, but it felt like an interrogation. "What's it to you?" Silas shot back. "It's a simple question," Doc replied, his voice still level. He was already pulling out his phone. Rhino gave a slight nod, an order issued without a word. Doc's fingers began to tap on the screen. Preacher took a step closer to Silas. "The girl looks hungry. Has she eaten?" The question hung in the air, thick and accusatory. The half-empty glass of water on Alara's table was a stark answer. Silas's face flushed. "She eats fine. I take care of her." He reached out to grab Alara's arm. A sudden, jerky movement born of panic. Before his fingers could touch her, another biker, a mountain of a man named Tiny, had moved from the other side of the booth. He didn't touch Silas. He simply stood there, an eclipse blocking the path. Silas's hand froze in mid-air. It was then that Rhino noticed the way Alara's sleeve had pulled up during her quick action. A line of small, circular bruises, ugly and purple-brown, marched up her forearm like a string of poisoned beads. Finger marks. He looked back at her face, at the yellowing shadow on her cheek. It wasn't dirt. "I think you should call her social worker," Rhino said, his voice a low growl. His eyes were still on Silas. "Make sure everything is on the level." Silas paled. "There's no need for that. We're fine." "Then you won't mind," Preacher said. It wasn't a question. Doc had a number now. He put the phone on speaker, the electronic tones piercing the tense silence of the diner. A woman's voice, bored and bureaucratic, answered. "County Child Services, Albright speaking." "Hello," Doc said, his tone polite, almost professional. "We're here at the Greasy Spoon Diner with a Mr. Silas Croft and his niece, Alara. We have some concerns about the child's welfare." There was a sigh on the other end of the line. Mr. Croft is her legal guardian. We are aware of the file. Is there a specific, actionable complaint? The word actionable was delivered with the weariness of someone who used it to end conversations. The girl has visible bruising on her arm and face, Doc stated, his voice flat and factual. She appears underfed. Another sigh. Sir, unless you are a mandated reporter witnessing an act of abuse, I can't open an investigation based on a third-party observation in a restaurant. Mr. Croft has been cleared by our office before. Alara is known to be clumsy. The dismissal was a physical blow. The men at the table exchanged glances. They knew this language. It was the sound of a system that was too tired, too overloaded, too indifferent to see what was right in front of it. It was the sound of a door being shut in a child's face. Silas smirked, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. The system was on his side. See? Told you. Now, Alara. Let's go. Now, he tried to push past Tiny, his confidence renewed. Rhino's voice cut through the air, cold as steel. She's not going anywhere with you. He finally removed his hand from Alara's shoulder and stood up. The full height of him, the sheer breadth of his shoulders, filled the space. The diner, which had begun to return to a low hum, fell silent once more. The system had failed. The gatekeepers had looked away. And in that moment, in the greasy air of a roadside diner, a different system with a different code was activated. Rhino looked down at Alara, whose eyes were wide, watching him. He gave her a slow, deliberate wink. He wasn't asking for her trust. He was earning it. The small apartment was 4 blocks away, on the 3rd floor of a crumbling brick building that smelled of damp and decay. It wasn't a home. It was a holding cell. Later that night, after Silas had been escorted out of the diner by 2 uniformed officers responding to a public disturbance call, a call made by Doc with calm, procedural precision, Preacher and his wife Sarah had taken Alara. They sat with her in a quiet corner of the diner, Sarah talking to her in a low, gentle voice about school and cartoons, while Preacher coordinated with Rhino. The club paid for everyone's meal in the diner, a silent apology for the disruption and a thank you for their patience. Then, 2 of the club's prospects were tasked with surveillance, parking a nondescript van across from Silas's building. They were to watch, to document, to be invisible. The backstory of Alara's life wasn't in a file in Ms. Albright's office. It was in the threadbare gray blanket on her small cot, folded with military neatness. It was in the single toy she owned, a small wooden horse whose paint had been worn off by the constant, worried motion of her thumb. It was in the absence of anything else. No posters on the wall, no books on a shelf, no crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator. The refrigerator itself held a half-empty carton of milk, a jar of mustard, and 3 beers. Nothing else. This information came from the prospect's initial report, whispered over a secure channel. They had gained access to the adjacent, vacant apartment, their skills not limited to motorcycle repair. Through the paper-thin walls, they could hear Silas returning, slamming the door, cursing to himself. They could hear the silence where a child's laughter should have been. Rhino sat in the clubhouse, the report crackling softly from the speaker. He pictured the room they described. He knew that kind of emptiness. He had grown up in it. The human cost of the system's failure was measured in the small, meticulous habits of a child who had learned to survive by taking up no space. Alara, now safe in Preacher and Sarah's warm, cluttered home, demonstrated this. She ate the hot soup Sarah gave her slowly, methodically, as if memorizing the taste, unsure when she might have it again. When Sarah showed her to the guest room, a room filled with soft pillows and a colorful quilt, Alara's first instinct was to sleep on the floor, on the small rug beside the bed. It was smaller, safer, less of a target. "You can sleep on the bed, sweetie," Sarah had said, her heart aching. "It's all for you." Alara had looked at her, her expression one of profound confusion, as if the very concept of comfort was a foreign language. She eventually climbed onto the bed, but she lay perfectly still on the very edge, her body rigid, as if expecting to be told to move. She hadn't spoken more than 10 words. Her story was told not in what she said, but in what she did. She automatically rinsed her soup bowl and tried to put it away, her arms too short to reach the cabinet. She folded her jacket, the same thin, worn-out sweatshirt, and placed it on the back of a chair before sitting down, a gesture of a child trained to never leave a mess, to never be a burden. Each of these small, heartbreaking details was relayed to Rhino and the others. It painted a picture far more damning than any photograph of a bruise. It was evidence of a spirit being systematically crushed, of a childhood being erased one small cruelty at a time. The club understood this calculus. They were men who lived by a strict, if unorthodox, set of rules. Loyalty, respect, honor. And at the top of that list was an unspoken, ironclad law: you do not harm a child. Ever. The system, with its forms and its files and its weary bureaucrats like Ms. Albright, had failed to see the person. They saw a case number, a statistic. They saw a clumsy girl and a legal guardian. The Hell's Angels saw Alara. They saw the quiet integrity in the way she carried her fear, the resilience in her small, determined act in the diner. They saw her not as a victim to be pitied, but as a person to be defended. Her quiet endurance had become their moral center. The weight of her small, silent world had settled on their leather-clad shoulders, and they would not shrug it off. They would carry it, and they would carry it into battle. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in controlled frustration. The club's first move was lawful, methodical, and utterly ineffective. Rhino, accompanied by Preacher and the club's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, went to the County Child Services office the next morning. Thorne was a sharp, impeccably dressed man who seemed an odd fit, but he had a long-standing relationship with the club, built on mutual respect and a shared disdain for bullies. They requested a meeting with Ms. Albright's supervisor. They were made to wait for 93 minutes in a beige waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. When they finally met with the supervisor, a harried-looking man named Peterson, their concerns were met with a wall of procedural jargon. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention," Peterson said, not looking them in the eye, his gaze fixed on a file on his desk. It was not Alara's file. However, as Ms. Albright noted, we have a history with this case. An assessment was completed 6 months ago. The home was deemed adequate. The girl has fresh bruises, Rhino said, his voice a low rumble that made Peterson's pen tremble slightly. "We have photographs." He slid a folder across the polished table. Peterson opened it, glanced at the clear, high-resolution photos Doc had taken, and pushed it back. "Bruises can be circumstantial. As Ms. Albright stated, the child is prone to accidents." Marcus Thorne leaned forward. "With all due respect, Mr. Peterson, a pattern of injuries combined with clear signs of neglect is not circumstantial. It's grounds for an emergency welfare check. A real one." Unannounced, Peterson sighed, the sound of a man defeated by his own bureaucracy. "I can authorize a follow-up visit. Ms. Albright will stop by the residence this afternoon." It was a token gesture, and they all knew it. An announced visit gave Silas time to coach Alara, to hide the beer, to put on a show. The system was designed to protect itself first, its ward second. As they left, frustrated and angry, the sense of helplessness was a bitter taste in their mouths. The escalation began that afternoon. Ms. Albright's visit was exactly the farce they had predicted. The prospects watching the building reported that Silas met her at the door, all smiles and false concern. He had bought a bag of groceries, the first they had seen him bring home, and placed it prominently on the kitchen counter. Alara was brought out, dressed in a new, ill-fitting dress, her hair clumsily brushed. From their listening post, the prospects could hear the stilted conversation. Ms. Albright asked Alara if she was happy, if her uncle took good care of her. They could hear the long, terrible pause before Alara's whispered, "Yes." They could hear the relief in Ms. Albright's voice as she ticked the boxes on her form. The visit lasted 11 minutes. The official report, which Thorne acquired through a legal back channel by the end of the day, stated, "Home environment is stable. Child reports no issues. Guardian is cooperative. Case closed." The words were a death sentence to hope. Fear began to curdle into a cold, hard rage. That night, the fear escalated for Alara. Silas, furious about the biker's interference and emboldened by the system's validation, took it out on her. The prospects recorded the sound, the sickening thud of a small body hitting a wall, the muffled cries, Silas's venomous whispers. You think they can help you? They're gone. I'm what you've got. You ever pull a stunt like that again, and you'll be sorry. The audio was clean, undeniable, and utterly horrifying. Doc, listening to the feed in the van, had to be physically restrained by the other prospect from storming the apartment. The evidence was mounting, a grim collection of audio files, photographs, and witness logs. Yet every official door they knocked on remained shut. The police said it was a civil matter for child services. Child services said the case was closed. The system was not just failing. It was actively enabling the abuse. The audience, the men of the club, listening to the reports, seeing the photos, hearing the muffled cries, felt a rising tide of helpless frustration. They had the firepower to end this in 5 minutes, to drag Silas out of that apartment and deliver a form of justice the legal system couldn't comprehend. But that was not the way. That would only validate the world's view of them and, more importantly, it would traumatize Alara further. It would be a victory for Rage, not for her. The club was a brotherhood of disciplined men, not a mob, and their president was about to remind them of that. The church meeting was called for 2100 hours. The clubhouse, usually a place of loud music and louder laughter, was silent. The air was thick with tension and the smell of old leather, motor oil, and simmering fury. 47 men, the full chapter roster plus representatives from 2 neighboring charters, stood in a rough circle in the main hall. No one sat. This was not a social call. At the center of the circle stood Rhino. He wasn't shouting. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, measured, yet it filled the cavernous room. We have a problem. He let the words hang in the air. We have a little girl who is being hurt. We have a man who is hurting her. And we have a system that is letting him do it. A system that hung up on us, that looked at our pictures and called them circumstantial. That signed a piece of paper today saying that little girl is safe. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his men. He saw the clenched jaws, the white knuckles. Every instinct in my body, and I know in yours, is to go to that 3rd-floor apartment and handle this our way. To deliver our justice. And I am telling you, we will not do that. A low murmur went through the crowd. A prospect in the back shifted his weight. His dissent a silent protest. Rhino's eyes found him instantly. You disagree? The prospect swallowed. President. He's hurting her. Right now. While we're standing here talking. He is. Rhino agreed, his voice dangerously soft. And if we go in there like a gang of thugs, what happens next? The cops arrest us. Silas plays the victim. And Alara? She gets thrown deeper into the system that failed her in the first place. She goes from one monster to 1,000 strangers. Is that a win? Is that protecting her? The room was silent again. He had them. He had reminded them of the stakes. This wasn't about their anger. It was about her future. This isn't about vengeance, Rhino continued, his voice gaining strength. This is about a principle. It's a foundational principle of this club. We protect our own, and we protect those who cannot protect themselves. That little girl saved my life. That makes her one of ours. The system broke its code. It failed in its duty. We will not break ours. He looked at Preacher, then at Doc, then at Marcus Thorne, who stood quietly by the door. Our way is not to be louder than the problem. Our way is to be smarter. Our way is to be more disciplined. They have forms and procedures. Fine. We will use them. They have laws. Fine. We will follow them. We will take their system, the one they used to dismiss her, and we will turn it on them like a weapon. We will not be thugs. We will be an army. A lawful, disciplined, and very public army. The catalyst had been triggered. The emotion, the raw, visceral anger that had been simmering for 3 days, was now being channeled. It was being forged from a blunt instrument of rage into a surgeon's scalpel of precision. They expect us to be animals, Rhino said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. So we will show them what it means to be men. We will expose their failure not with fists, but with facts. Not with violence, but with visibility. We are going to hold a mirror up to them, and the whole world is going to see the monster they've ignored. He raised his hand, palm out. The vote is not on whether we act. The vote is on whether we agree to act as one. By the book. Thorne's book, one by one. Every man in the room raised his hand. The vote was unanimous. The quiet hum of rage had transformed into the silent, terrifying thrum of a machine preparing to move. The plan was set in motion. The mobilization was a thing of quiet, brutal efficiency. It began not with a roar, but with a series of clicks and whispers. 1800 hours. Marcus Thorne, working from a makeshift office in the clubhouse, filed an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order against Silas, and a motion for a formal custody hearing. He cited the audio evidence as a credible threat of imminent harm. The court's initial response was a 48-hour review period. Too long. Thorne needed to force their hand. 21:05 hours. Immediately after the church meeting, the calls went out. Preacher, acting as sergeant-at-arms, coordinated the logistics. The message was simple. President's orders. Dress uniform. Parade formation. County building. 1,000 hours dress uniform meant clean, pressed jeans, polished boots, and a clean vest, or cut no weapons, no attitude. This was about presentation. Parade formation meant arriving together, parking in silent, perfect rows. This was about discipline. 2,200 hours. Engines began to start. Not just locally, but across 3 states. Charters from Nevada and Arizona, alerted to the situation, had pledged their support. They weren't coming for a fight. They were coming to stand, to be counted. The head count grew from the 47 local members to 82. Then 114. By dawn, the number would approach 150. Each man was a symbol, a single disciplined cell in a larger organism. 1 o'clock hours. Doc and his team worked on the presentation of evidence. The muffled audio of the abuse was cleaned up. The sound of Alara's crying isolated and amplified slightly, not for melodrama, but for clarity. The photographs of her bruises were printed in high-resolution 8x10s. A timeline of events was created, detailing every call to child services, every dismissive response, every minute of Ms. Albright's 11-minute visit. Each fact was a bullet being loaded into a magazine. 3 o'clock hours. A separate team, led by a biker who owned a small printing press, began making signs. They were not provocative. They were factual. 11 minutes was not enough. Ms. Albright. Listen to the tape. Case #72B41. A child is hurting. We are her voice. Each sign was a headline. A direct accusation backed by the evidence they now held. 5 o'clock hours. Marcus Thorne sent a single, carefully worded email to a curated list of local and national news reporters. It was not a press release. It was a tip. Evidence of systemic failure and child endangerment at County Child Services to be presented publicly. 10 a.m. 150 concerned citizens will be in attendance to demand accountability. He attached the case number and a single, heavily redacted audio clip, just enough to be compelling. 7 o'clock hours. The riders began to converge at a staging point 5 miles outside the city. The low rumble of over 100 V-twin engines was a rising thunder. But the men themselves were quiet, drinking coffee from thermoses, checking their bikes, receiving their final briefing from Preacher. The mood was somber, focused. They were a wave, gathering its strength far from shore, preparing to crash down on a system that had grown complacent and deaf. 9:45 hours, Alara, who had spent the night at Preacher and Sarah's home, was taken to a quiet park by Sarah and 2 other wives from the club. She was kept far from the coming confrontation, protected from the storm that was about to break in her name. Sarah gave her a small sketchbook and new crayons. For the first time in days, Alara smiled. A small, hesitant curve of her lips as she drew a picture of a large, lumpy animal she decided was a rhinoceros. 10 o'clock hours. The wave hit. It arrived not as a chaotic swarm, but as a disciplined procession. 147 motorcycles turned onto the broad avenue leading to the County Social Services building. They moved in perfect staggered formation, 2 by 2, their engines a synchronized, deafening heartbeat. Traffic stopped. Pedestrians froze on the sidewalks, their phones instantly emerging to record the spectacle. The riders didn't rev their engines or shout. They simply rode, a river of chrome and black leather flowing toward the sterile, glass-fronted building. They filled the parking lot, each bike backing into a space with practiced precision until they formed a silent, intimidating crescent around the main entrance. The engines cut out in a rolling cascade of silence. The sudden quiet was more profound than the noise had been. 147 men dismounted. They moved without orders, taking up positions on the public plaza in front of the building. They formed silent ranks, 3 deep, a human wall between the institution and the street. Then, on an unseen signal, they raised their signs. The effect was stunning. A forest of stark, black and white accusations bloomed in the morning sun. Inside, office workers began to appear at the windows, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Ms. Albright, on her way back from a coffee run, stopped dead in the crosswalk, her latte slipping from her grasp. She saw her own name on a dozen signs, held by men whose faces were grim, unyielding masks. This was not a protest. It was a reckoning. As if on cue, the news vans began to arrive, their satellite dishes rising into the sky. Marcus Thorne, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, stepped through the ranks of the bikers, who parted for him like the sea. He carried a single, slim briefcase. He walked to the foot of the stairs, faced the cameras, and waited. The confrontation was not to be with Silas. He was a symptom. The disease was the apathy institutionalized within the building behind him. A security guard emerged from the main doors, his hand on his radio, his expression panicked. Preacher met him at the bottom of the steps. "We are on public property," Preacher said, his voice calm and steady. "We will not obstruct access to the building. We are here to bear witness." The guard, a man half Preacher's size, looked at the silent army behind him and wisely chose not to argue. The public stage was set. The hypocrisy was about to be exposed under the full glare of television cameras. The bikers formed a protective corridor, a silent honor guard, as Thorne began to speak. He didn't need a microphone. The quiet was absolute. His voice was crisp, professional, and damning. "Good morning. My name is Marcus Thorne. We are here today on behalf of a 7-year-old girl, known in court documents as Alara C. We are here because the system designed to protect her has catastrophically failed." He gestured to the building behind him. "For 3 days, we have attempted to work within that system. We presented photographic evidence of abuse to officials in this building. We were told it was circumstantial. We warned them of ongoing danger. They conducted an 11-minute welfare check, declared her safe, and closed the case from inside the building." Peterson and Ms. Albright watched from a second-story window, their faces ashen. They could see their own names on the signs. This was not a biker rally. It was a meticulously planned legal ambush. Thorne opened his briefcase. He pulled out a small digital audio player and a speaker. "The system told us they heard no cause for concern. I want you to hear what they should have heard." He pressed a button. The sound that filled the plaza was horrific. It was the audio from the prospect's listening device. Silas's slurred, angry voice, the sound of a slap, and Alara's sharp, terrified cry. A collective gasp went through the crowd of reporters and onlookers. The bikers did not flinch. Their faces remained stoic, but a cold fire burned in their eyes. They had all heard it before. This was for the world to hear. Thorne let the tape play for 30 seconds, then stopped it. That was recorded 6 hours after Ms. Albright declared Alara's home environment to be stable, 6 hours after this institution closed her case. He held up one of the 8 by 10 photos of the bruises on Alara's arm. The detail was sickeningly clear. "This," he said, his voice ringing with controlled anger, "is not clumsy. This is a handprint. These are finger marks." The masks began to drop. The official narrative, so carefully constructed from bureaucratic indifference, was being publicly dismantled piece by piece. As if on cue, a woman stepped out from the crowd of bystanders. She was a neighbor from Ilara's building. Emboldened by the biker's formidable presence, her fear had finally been eclipsed by her conscience. "He yells at her all the time," she said, her voice shaking but clear enough for the news microphones to pick up. "I've called. They never do anything." Another man, the clerk from the corner store, stepped forward. "He buys beer and cigarettes with the state benefits card. Never food. The little girl comes in sometimes. Just to stand where it's warm." The truth was surfacing. A flood released by the dam of fear being broken. The biker's presence had done more than intimidate the system. It had created a zone of safety for the silent, frightened community. They were a shield for the truth. Thorne then produced a document. This is a copy of Silas Croft's bank statement, obtained legally this morning. It shows that for the past 2 years, 94% of the survivor benefits issued for Ilara's care have been spent at liquor stores and racetracks. The revelation hung in the air, a testament not just to one man's cruelty, but to a system's utter lack of oversight. Inside the building, phones were ringing. The county commissioner was on the line to Peterson, his voice apoplectic. The story was already leading every local news website. The public confrontation had become a public crucifixion of institutional negligence. Rhino stood at the back of the formation, watching it all unfold. He had not said a word. He didn't need to. His army was moving with disciplined precision, their silence a more powerful indictment than any threat could ever be. They had exposed the rot, not by breaking down the door, but by shining a light so bright that the whole world could see through the windows. The truth was out. Now it was time for accountability. The emergency custody hearing was convened less than 4 hours later. A judge, having seen the news reports and received a blistering call from a state senator, had signed the order immediately. The courtroom was small, but it felt vast and intimidating. On one side sat Silas, his face a sickly gray, accompanied by a flustered, court-appointed lawyer who looked like he had already given up. On the other side sat Marcus Thorne, with Preacher and Sarah beside him. The back of the courtroom was a silent sea of leather and denim. 50 bikers, the maximum the bailiffs would allow inside, filled the benches. They didn't sit. They stood, lining the back wall, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. They were not there to intimidate the court. They were there to bear witness for a little girl who couldn't be there herself. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Maria Santos, entered and took her seat. Her eyes swept over the unusual gallery, lingering for a moment on the silent figures in the back before settling on Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice sharp, "this is a highly irregular situation. You have made some very serious allegations in a very public forum." "I have made no allegations, Your Honor," Thorne replied, rising to his feet. "I have only presented evidence that your county's own agents chose to ignore. The proceedings were swift, brutal, and clinical." Thorne didn't grandstand. He simply presented the facts. He played the audio recording again, this time for the official court record. The sound of Ilara's cry echoed in the hushed, wood-paneled room, a sound that made Judge Santos's jaw tighten. He submitted the dated photographs, the bank statements, the log of every ignored call to the Child Services hotline. He called the neighbor and the store clerk to the stand. Their testimony was brief, heartfelt, and devastating. When it was Silas's turn, his lawyer advised him to plead the fifth. Silas, sweating profusely, just shook his head, muttering that it was all a misunderstanding. Judge Santos looked at him with open contempt. "A misunderstanding?" she asked, her voice dripping with ice. "The evidence before me suggests not a misunderstanding, but a pattern of criminal neglect and abuse. The fact that it took a motorcycle club to do the job of my county's social services is an embarrassment that will be dealt with. But right now, my only concern is the welfare of this child." The verdict was a foregone conclusion. "The parental rights of Silas Croft are hereby terminated, effective immediately," Judge Santos declared, her gavel striking the wood with a sharp crack of finality. A warrant is to be issued for his arrest on charges of child endangerment and felony misuse of state funds. Silas slumped in his chair, a broken, pathetic figure. But the fight wasn't over. That leaves the question of placement for the child, the judge continued, looking at Thorne. The state's recommendation will be foster care, pending a full investigation. Your Honor, Thorne interjected smoothly. We have a better option, he introduced Preacher and Sarah. He presented their file. A stable home, no criminal records, steady income from their family-owned garage, and a long list of character references. He also submitted a notarized document, signed by every member of the local chapter, pledging a portion of their monthly income to a trust fund for Alara's education and care. It was an unprecedented show of collective, lawful support. The judge reviewed the documents, her expression shifting from skepticism to surprise, and finally to a grudging respect. She looked at Preacher and Sarah, then at the silent wall of men behind them. She saw not a gang, but a community organized and committed. Temporary custody is granted to Mr. and Mrs. Connolly, she announced, pending a full home study, which I am ordering to be expedited. This court is satisfied that the child will be in a safe, and dare I say, fiercely protected environment. The sound in the courtroom was not a cheer, but a collective, quiet exhale. Justice, delivered publicly and legally, had been served. As the bikers filed out of the courtroom, Rhino paused as he passed Thorne. Good work, counselor. You made it easy, Thorne replied. Judges tend to listen when 150 witnesses show up, outside. The reforms were already beginning. The county commissioner had announced on the courthouse steps that Ms. Albright and her supervisor, Peterson, were suspended pending a full internal investigation. He promised a top-to-bottom review of child services policies. Wrongs were being rectified, and for the first time in a long time, dignity was being restored. The Real resolution, however, was happening miles away, in a quiet park, where Sarah knelt down and told a little girl drawing a picture that she was coming home with them, for good. And Alara, for the first time, cried, not from fear or pain, but from the staggering, overwhelming relief of being safe. The ripples spread outward, changing the landscape long after the initial splash. 6 months later, Alara was a different child. The haunted, weary look in her eyes had been replaced by a bright spark of curiosity. She laughed now, a sound that filled Preacher and Sarah's home, a sound the entire club had come to cherish. She was enrolled in school, where a tutor, paid for by her trust fund, helped her catch up. She had friends. She was thriving, nurtured by the unconditional, if unconventional, love of her new, extended family. The club, true to Rhino's word, had formalized their mission. They established a non-profit foundation, funded by a series of charity rides that drew thousands of bikers from across the country. They called it Alara's Ride. Its purpose was simple: to provide pro bono legal services and private investigators for children trapped in failing, bureaucratic systems. Marcus Thorne sat on the board, overseeing a team of young, idealistic lawyers who now had the resources to fight cases the state had abandoned. The foundation's office was a clean, modern space, a stark contrast to the clubhouse, but on the wall of the reception area hung a large, framed photograph. 147 motorcycles parked in a perfect crescent in front of the county building, a symbol of lawful, disciplined intervention. The systemic changes were real. The investigation at County Child Services had led to 3 dismissals and a complete overhaul of their intake and review process. The Alara C case, as it came to be known, was now a mandatory part of their training curriculum, a case study in catastrophic failure and the power of public accountability. The community, once silent, had found its voice. Neighbors looked out for each other with a renewed sense of shared responsibility. Calls to the child abuse hotline tripled in the months following the incident, not because there was more abuse, but because people finally believed someone would listen. The legacy was not one of revenge, but of restoration. It was present in the small moments. A biker, on his way home from the clubhouse, stopping to help a stranded motorist, his Hell's Angels vest no longer inspiring automatic fear, but a flicker of recognition and respect. It was in the annual Alara's Ride toy run, where thousands of motorcycles delivered presents to children in foster care. A rolling thunder of generosity. The final scene of this chapter unfolded on a bright Saturday afternoon in July. It was the club's annual family picnic. Alara, now 8, was perched in the custom-built sidecar attached to Rhino's gleaming motorcycle. She wore a tiny, custom-made leather vest over her summer dress. It had no club patches, only a single, beautifully embroidered image on the back. A small wooden horse. She was laughing, her head tilted back, the wind whipping through her hair as they led a procession of families. Bikers, their wives, their children, on a slow, celebratory ride through the sun-drenched countryside. Rhino looked over at her, his rugged face softened by a genuine smile. She had saved his life with a small, brave act. In return, his brotherhood had saved hers, not by breaking the law, but by bending the arc of justice toward her. They had become the system they wished to see in the world. One that was vigilant, disciplined, and unwavering in its protection of the innocent. The sound of their engines was no longer just the sound of rebellion. It was the sound of a promise kept, a powerful, enduring symbol of courage, community, and the profound truth that sometimes, the most fearsome angels are the ones who ride to your rescue.